Sometimes the greatest battles aren't fought with swords, but with hope when everyone else has given up. Sometimes a gentle giant shows up just when you need them most. Brynja was the daughter of a Viking Jarl who hadn't walked in over a year. A fever had stolen the strength from her legs. The healers had failed. Her village was preparing for her funeral. Even her father had stopped believing she would ever stand again. Then came Torgar Bearborn, a massive warrior who decided to help when no one else would. Day after day, he worked with her. The village laughed at them both. They said it was hopeless. But on the morning of the spring feast, Brynja walked into that great hall. What she did next left every single person in tears. What could make an entire room of hardened Vikings weep? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the fjord like the breath of sleeping gods, and in the great hall of Jarl Steinar, silence had become a familiar companion. Where once laughter and the clatter of wooden bowls had filled the cavernous space, now only the whisper of servants' feet and the occasional crackle from the central hearth broke the heavy quiet. Brynja lay in her chamber, watching dust motes dance in the pale light that filtered through the single window. Her fingers traced the intricate carvings on the birchwood walking stick that rested beside her bed. A gift from her grandmother, carved with runes that spoke of strength and perseverance. The stick had been crafted for an old woman's twilight years, yet here it waited, unused, beside a girl who should have been running through meadows and dancing at harvest celebrations. The fever had come with the last winter storms, striking her down when she was barely 16. For 3 weeks, she had burned with a heat that no amount of snow pressed to her skin could cool. When the fever finally broke, it took with it the feeling in her legs, leaving them as lifeless as fallen branches. The healers, wise women who had traveled from distant settlements, had tried everything. Herbs gathered under the full moon, chants passed down through generations, even the painful ritual of ice baths, followed by heated stones pressed to her spine. Nothing restored what the sickness had stolen. Jarl Steinar had aged a decade in that single year. The man who once stood tall as an oak, whose voice could command 100 warriors, now moved through his halls like a shadow of himself. His wife, Astrid, had died giving birth to Brynja 16 years ago, and the girl had been his heart's sole anchor. Watching her waste away, unable to help despite all his wealth and power, had broken something fundamental in the proud leader. The household staff whispered among themselves, though never within earshot of their Jarl. They spoke of burial preparations that had been quietly begun, of the wood already cut for a funeral pyre, of the way Steinar stared into his ale each evening as if searching for answers in its amber depths. Some said he consulted with the old priests about the proper rites for a daughter who would never marry, never give him grandchildren, never inherit the wisdom needed to guide their people. Brynja knew. She heard the hushed conversations, saw the way people's eyes skated over her when they visited the hall. She had become invisible, a ghost haunting her own life. Even her father, who loved her more than his own breath, struggled to meet her gaze for more than a moment before pain forced him to look away. Outside her window, the village carried on its daily rhythms. Children played in the muddy spaces between houses, their shouts echoing off the wooden walls. Women carried water from the well, their backs straight and strong. Men returned from fishing expeditions or hunting parties, their bodies moving with the easy confidence of those who trusted their limbs to carry them wherever they needed to go. Brynja watched it all from her elevated prison, feeling more removed from life than if she had been truly dead. The walking stick caught the morning light, its carved runes seeming to shift and dance in her peripheral vision. Her grandmother had pressed it into her hands just before the fever struck, saying it would serve her well in times of great trial. The old woman had been known for her peculiar wisdom, the kind that spoke in riddles and saw truth in dreams. Brynja had smiled and accepted the gift with the indulgence one shows to beloved elders, never imagining she would have cause to need such a thing. Now she understood. The stick wasn't meant for physical walking alone. It was meant for the journey through darkness, the path from despair towards something she couldn't yet name. But understanding and accepting were different things entirely. The stick remained beside her bed, untouched save for her occasional tracing of its surface, a constant reminder of mobility she might never regain. Her chamber door stood slightly ajar, as it always did now. Privacy was a luxury afforded to those who might have visitors, who might have reason to conduct the business of living behind closed doors. Brynja's door remained open because her father needed to hear her breathing, needed the reassurance that she still drew air into her lungs. It was a kindness that felt like surveillance, love that had transformed into vigil. Through that gap came the sounds of the hall's morning routine. Servants banking the fires from the night before, preparing the first meal of the day, setting out the Jarl's clothes and weapons. Life continued its forward motion around her stillness, like water flowing around a stone embedded in a riverbed. She had become part of the landscape of sadness that now defined this place, as permanent and immovable as the wooden beams that held up the roof. But this morning brought something different. Heavy footsteps, heavier than any she had heard before, crossed the main hall with deliberate purpose. These weren't the hurried steps of servants or the measured pace of her father. These footsteps belonged to someone substantial, someone who moved with the confidence of a man who had never doubted his place in the world. The voice that followed was equally distinctive, deep and resonant, carrying the accent of the northern settlements. Brynja strained to hear the words, catching only fragments through the layers of wood and distance. Her father's voice joined the conversation, higher with surprise and something that might have been curiosity. It had been so long since Steinar had shown interest in anything beyond his daily obligations that the sound made Brynja's heart quicken with an emotion she had almost forgotten how to feel. Hope was a dangerous thing for someone in her position. She had learned to push it away, to focus instead on the immediate reality of her limitations. Hope demanded energy she couldn't afford to waste, promised futures that seemed increasingly impossible. Yet something in those footsteps, in the way they moved without hesitation or apology, made her think of the walking stick beside her bed and the grandmother who had carved stories of perseverance into its surface. The morning light grew stronger, burning away the mist that had cloaked the fjord. From her window, Brynja could see the water beginning to sparkle, reflecting the pale sun like scattered coins. It was going to be a clear day, the kind that made even the hardest hearts believe in possibility. She found herself listening more intently to the conversation in the hall, her fingers unconsciously moving to the walking stick's familiar grooves and ridges. Change was coming. She could feel it in the way the very air seemed to shift, the way the sounds of the hall took on a different quality. After a year of stagnation, of slow surrender to an unchangeable fate, something was stirring in the house of Jarl Steinar. Brynja didn't yet know whether to fear it or welcome it, but she could no longer ignore it. The walking stick seemed to warm under her touch, as if responding to her grandmother's spirit, or perhaps to the first tentative stirring of her own will to try again. The door to Brynja's chamber swung open with unusual force, and her father stepped inside, his face carrying an expression she hadn't seen in months. Uncertainty mixed with something that might have been possibility. Behind him loomed a figure so large that he had to duck beneath the doorframe, his massive shoulders barely fitting through the opening. Torgar Bearborn was aptly named. Standing nearly 7 feet tall, with arms like tree trunks and a chest that seemed carved from granite, he commanded attention simply by existing. His beard, streaked with premature gray despite his 30-odd years, hung to his belt, and his pale blue eyes held a gentleness that seemed at odds with his fearsome reputation. Battle scars crisscrossed his exposed forearms, telling stories of conflicts that had made him legend throughout the northern territories. "Daughter?" Steinar said, his voice carrying an awkward formality that spoke to how long it had been since he'd had reason for introductions in her chamber. "This is Torgar Bearborn. He has come with an offer." Brynja pulled her sleeping furs up to her chin, suddenly conscious of her appearance. It had been weeks since she'd bothered with braiding her hair or caring about anything beyond the basic requirements of staying alive. Now, faced with this mountain of a man whose reputation preceded him into every hall in Norway, she felt exposed and fragile. Torgar stepped forward, his movement surprisingly graceful for someone of his size. When he spoke, his voice carried the warmth of a hearth fire, completely at odds with the intimidation his presence might have suggested. "Young lady," he said, settling onto the wooden stool beside her bed with careful deliberation, "your father tells me you've forgotten how to walk." The bluntness of his statement should have stung, but something in his tone stripped it of cruelty. He spoke as if discussing a skill that could be relearned, like weaving or smithcraft, rather than a permanent condition that defined her existence. "I haven't forgotten," Brynja replied, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "The fever took the strength from my legs. The healers say it will not return." Torgar nodded thoughtfully, his massive hands resting on his knees. "Healers know much about herbs and spirits," he said, "but sometimes they know less about what the human heart can accomplish when properly motivated." Steinar shifted uncomfortably in the doorway. "Torgar, I appreciate your interest, but we have consulted the wisest." "With respect, Jarl," Torgar interrupted gently. "Wisdom and experience are different things. I've seen men walk who should have died, fight when their bodies had given up, accomplish what every reasonable person declared impossible." He turned his attention back to Brynja. "The question isn't whether your legs remember how to carry you. The question is whether you remember why you wanted to walk in the first place." Something in his words struck a chord deep in Brynja's chest. For months, she had focused entirely on the mechanics of her condition, the deadness in her limbs, the failure of treatments, the steady accumulation of evidence that she would never recover. But Torgar spoke of something else entirely, something that had nothing to do with sensation returning to nerveless flesh, and everything to do with will. "What do you propose?" she asked, though part of her feared the answer. Torgar reached into the leather pouch at his belt and withdrew something that made Brynja's breath catch in her throat. It was a brace, clearly crafted by a master metalsmith, made of iron bands and leather padding. But, unlike the crude devices she had seen before, this one was beautiful, decorated with etched patterns that caught the morning light and curved in ways that suggested both strength and grace. "This was made for my sister," Torgar said quietly. "She was thrown from her horse during a raid, landed wrong, couldn't feel her legs for 2 years. The healers told her the same things yours have told you." He set the brace on the bed beside her walking stick. "She wore this every day for 6 months. Not because it made her walk, it couldn't do that. She wore it because it reminded her that walking was still possible." "Where is she now?" Brynja asked, though she could see the answer in the careful way Torgar composed his features. "She died in childbirth 3 years ago," he said simply. "But she died walking. She died dancing at her wedding feast, laughing at her husband's terrible jokes, living the life she chose rather than the life her injury tried to choose for her." He met Brynja's eyes directly. The brace couldn't heal her legs, but it helped her heal everything else. Steinar had grown very still in the doorway. Brynja could see him struggling with hope and fear, wanting to believe but terrified of the disappointment that might follow. She understood his conflict perfectly. It mirrored her own. "What would you require of me?" she asked. "Everything," Torgar said without hesitation. "Every morning, we work. When you want to quit, we work harder. When you cry, we work through the tears. When you hate me, and you will, we work despite the hatred." His voice remained gentle, but iron ran through it now. I don't promise you'll walk like you did before. I promise you'll discover what you can become if you refuse to accept what others say is impossible." Brynja looked at the brace, then at her grandmother's walking stick, then at her father's face where hope and terror warred for dominance. The choice before her wasn't really about walking. It was about whether to remain safely ensconced in her limitations or risk everything on the possibility that those limitations might not be permanent. "The village will mock us," she said. "Let them. I might fail completely. Failure is only final if you stop trying. My father has suffered enough disappointment." Torgar glanced toward Steinar, then back to her. "Your father has suffered enough watching his daughter disappear. Whether you walk or crawl or roll, you owe it to him and to yourself to try living again." The words hung in the air like a challenge and a promise combined. Brynja felt something stirring in her chest that she had almost forgotten existed. Not hope exactly, but curiosity about what lay on the other side of effort. For a year, she had accepted the verdict of healers and the evidence of her own senses. Now this giant of a man suggested there might be verdicts yet to be written. "When do we begin?" she asked. Torgar's smile transformed his entire face, revealing warmth that had been hidden beneath his serious expression. "We already have." As he rose from the stool, careful not to bump his head on the low ceiling, Brynja understood that her life had just shifted direction as surely as a ship changing course in response to changing winds. Whether that course led to triumph or deeper disappointment remained to be seen, but the essential fact was movement itself. After a year of stagnation, she was moving again. Her fingers closed around her grandmother's walking stick, and for the first time in months, she imagined what it might feel like to put weight on it, to use it as it was intended. The thought brought fear, but beneath the fear lay something else, a flutter of possibility that refused to be silenced. The first attempt came the following dawn, when mist still clung to the wooden walls and the household slept deeply. Torgar appeared in her doorway, carrying a steaming bowl of porridge and wearing an expression of quiet determination that matched the early hour. "Eat," he commanded, setting the bowl on the small table beside her bed. "You'll need strength for what comes next." Brynja had barely slept, her mind churning with anticipation and dread. The leg brace lay beside her walking stick, both artifacts seeming to mock her with their unused potential. She had spent hours staring at the ceiling, imagining scenarios that ranged from miraculous success to crushing humiliation. "What exactly comes next?" she asked, accepting the porridge with hands that trembled slightly. "We find out what your legs remember," Torgar said, settling into his now familiar position on the wooden stool. "But first, we find out what you remember about wanting things." The question puzzled her. Wanting things? When did you last want something badly enough to fight for it? His pale blue eyes studied her face with unsettling intensity. Not hope for it, not wish for it. Want it with a kind of hunger that makes you willing to bleed. Brynja considered the question while stirring her porridge. The honest answer was that she couldn't remember. For so long, her world had narrowed to the basic requirements of survival, eating enough to maintain strength, sleeping enough to pass time, existing without causing her father additional pain. Desire had seemed like a luxury she couldn't afford. "I used to want to ride," she said finally. "Before the fever, I had a mare named Sunbeam. I wanted to ride her to the summer markets, to see the world beyond our fjord." The memory brought unexpected pain. "Father sold her when it became clear I wouldn't recover." Torgar nodded. "Good. Hold on to that feeling, not the sadness, but the wanting itself. We're going to need it." He stood and moved to the foot of her bed, his massive hands surprisingly gentle as he pulled back the sleeping furs that covered her legs. Brynja instinctively tried to cover herself, but he shook his head. "Modesty is a luxury we can't afford," he said, matter-of-factly. I need to see what we're working with. Her legs lay pale and thin beneath her sleeping shift, muscles visibly wasted from months of disuse. Torgar examined them with the clinical attention of someone accustomed to assessing damage, his fingers probing gently along her calves and thighs. Sensation? He asked. None. Movement? None that I can control. He lifted her right leg at the knee, testing its weight and flexibility. The limb moved like dead wood in his hands, offering no resistance and no cooperation. Brynja forced herself to watch, though seeing her body handled like a broken tool brought fresh waves of humiliation. Your muscles have forgotten their purpose, Torgar said, lowering her leg back to the bed. But muscles can learn again. The question is whether your spirit is willing to teach them. He reached for the leg brace, its metal components catching the pale morning light. Up close, Brynja could see the craftsmanship more clearly. Every joint had been carefully fitted, every piece of leather padding precisely placed to prevent chafing and distribute weight evenly. This will feel strange at first, Torgar warned, beginning the process of fitting the brace around her right leg. Strange and probably uncomfortable. Your body will want to reject it. The metal was cold against her skin, and the weight of it felt alien after so many months of weightless immobility. Torgar worked with practiced efficiency, adjusting straps and testing the fit with careful attention to detail. When he finished, Brynja's leg looked like some kind of mechanical hybrid, half flesh and half device. Now, he said, we try. The process of moving from bed to standing position was far more complex than Brynja had remembered. Torgar supported most of her weight as she swung her legs over the side of the bed, the braced leg moving awkwardly but maintaining its position. Her left leg hung useless, but the brace gave her right leg structure and stability it had lacked for months. Breathe, Torgar instructed as she gripped his forearm with strength that surprised them both. Fear makes everything harder. Standing upright felt like defying gravity itself. Blood rushed from her head, leaving her dizzy and nauseous. Her legs, one braced, one hanging, bore no weight at all. Torgar's strength kept her vertical while her body remembered what vertical meant. I can't, she began. You can't yet, Torgar corrected. Different thing entirely. They stayed like that for perhaps a minute, Brynja learning to trust the brace and Torgar's support, while her body adjusted to a position it hadn't held in over a year. When her vision cleared and the dizziness passed, she found herself looking out the window from a perspective she had forgotten existed. The view from standing was different, more expansive, more connected to the world beyond her chamber. She could see farther across the fjord, could observe the village from an angle that made her feel like a participant rather than a spectator. It was a small thing, but it carried enormous significance. Enough for today, Torgar said, helping her settle back onto the bed. Tomorrow we try for longer. As he removed the brace, Brynja felt an unexpected sense of loss. The device had been uncomfortable and alien, but it had also been possibility made tangible. Without it, she returned to being a girl with useless legs. With it, she became someone attempting the impossible. Did your sister feel this discouraged after her first day? She asked as Torgar packed the brace away. She threw a chamber pot at my head, he said with a slight smile. Called me 17 different kinds of fool and demanded I leave her alone to die in peace. What changed her mind? Torgar paused in his packing, considering the question. She realized that giving up meant letting her injury make all her decisions. She decided she'd rather make them herself, even if the choices were harder. After he left, Brynja lay staring at her grandmother's walking stick, her mind replaying those brief moments of vertical existence. Her legs ached in ways they hadn't for months. Not pain exactly, but the echo of effort, the memory of purpose attempting to reassert itself. Outside her window, the village was waking to another ordinary day. Children would play, adults would work. Life would continue its forward momentum. But something had shifted in her small corner of that world. She had stood upright, if only for a moment. She had remembered what it felt like to look out at the world from the perspective of someone who might yet have places to go. The walking stick seemed to glow in the morning light, its carved runes appearing almost alive with possibility. Her grandmother had known something when she'd crafted this gift, had seen something in the future that required preparation. Brynja was beginning to understand that preparation wasn't just about having the right tools, it was about having the right heart. By the end of the first week, whispers had begun to circulate through the village like smoke from poorly tended fires. The servants spoke in hushed tones about the strange giant who visited the Jarl's daughter each morning, carrying mysterious devices and spending hours behind her closed door. The village women, gathering water at the communal well, exchanged meaningful glances and carefully worded questions about what exactly Torgar Bearborn thought he could accomplish where trained healers had failed. Eric the blacksmith was the first to voice what many were thinking. A man of considerable reputation despite his tendency toward skepticism, he cornered Jarl Steinar outside the village meeting hall on a grey morning when rain threatened but had not yet begun to fall. "Jarl," Eric said, his weathered hands working nervously with the leather apron he wore even when not at his forge. "The people are concerned about this arrangement with the Bearborn fellow." Steinar paused in his stride, turning to face a man he had known since childhood. Eric's doubt was written plainly across his honest features, not malicious, but genuinely worried about what he perceived as false hope being offered to a man who had already suffered too much disappointment. "What concerns them?" Steinar asked, though he suspected he knew the answer. "We've watched you grieve for your daughter," Eric said carefully. "We've seen what this year has cost you. To raise hopes now, when every healer from here to the northern settlements has declared her condition permanent." He struggled to find words that wouldn't sound like accusations. "Some fear you're being taken advantage of by a man trading on his reputation." The accusation stung, partly because Steinar had harbored similar doubts during the long nights when sleep eluded him. Torgar asked for nothing. No payment, no promises of reward should he succeed. His only requirement was complete commitment to the process, whatever that might entail. Such generosity felt suspicious in a world where most services came with clearly defined costs. "Has anyone spoken to him about his methods?" Steinar asked. "He answers no questions," Eric replied. "Says the work speaks for itself." "But Jarl, what work? Your daughter has been bedridden for over a year. What could possibly—" "She stood yesterday." The words stopped Eric mid-sentence. The blacksmith's mouth opened, then closed, then opened again without producing sound. Around them, the village continued its morning routine, but for these two men, time seemed to pause. "Stood how?" Eric finally managed. "On her own legs, supported but standing." Steinar's voice carried a mixture of wonder and uncertainty that made Eric's skepticism waver. For perhaps 2 minutes, she looked out her window from a standing position. Eric absorbed this information like a man trying to understand a foreign language. He had seen Brynja before her illness, a spirited girl who ran faster than most boys, who climbed trees with the fearlessness of youth, who seemed to contain enough energy to power the entire village. He had also seen her during the worst of the fever, when death seemed more likely than recovery. The girl who had emerged from that illness bore little resemblance to the child who had fallen sick. "The brace," Eric said suddenly, understanding dawning in his eyes. "I heard he brought some kind of device." "Crafted for his sister, who suffered a similar injury." Steinar found himself defending Torgar's methods even as he questioned them privately. "She recovered enough to live normally." Recovered or learned to manage? The distinction was important, and both men knew it. Recovery implied restoration of what had been lost. Management implied acceptance of limitation while finding ways to work within constraints. The difference between the two could mean everything or nothing, depending on perspective. Inside her chamber, Brynja was discovering the truth of that distinction firsthand. The morning session with Torgar had progressed to taking actual steps, 3 shuffling, supported movements that could charitably be called walking. Her right leg, stabilized by the brace, had borne weight for brief moments. Her left leg had contributed nothing but dead weight that needed to be dragged along. But she had moved forward under her own power. The distance covered could be measured in inches, but the psychological territory crossed felt vast as mountain ranges. "Pain?" Torgar asked as he helped her settle back onto the bed. "Different than I expected." She struggled to articulate the sensation. "Not sharp, not burning, more like my body arguing with itself about what's possible." Torgar nodded as if her description made perfect sense. "Your mind remembers walking, your muscles remember walking, but they've forgotten how to work together. We're teaching them to have conversations again." The walking stick lay across her lap, and she found herself gripping it tighter during each attempt at movement. The carved wood seemed to warm under her touch, as if responding to the effort she was putting forth. Her grandmother had been a woman of peculiar wisdom, known throughout the region for insights that seemed to come from sources beyond ordinary observation. Had she somehow foreseen this struggle? Had she carved strength into the wood itself? "Tell me about her," Torgar said, noticing her focus on the stick. "My grandmother. She died the winter before my illness. Some said she was touched by the gods, others that she was simply very observant." Brynja traced the intricate rune patterns with her fingertip. She never walked quite right herself, old injury from her youth, but she moved like someone who refused to let limitations define her. "Wise woman, what did she tell you when she gave you the stick?" "That it would serve me well in times of great trial." Brynja looked up at Torgar's patient face. "I thought she meant when I was old, like her. I never imagined." "She knew," Torgar said with quiet certainty. "Women like that usually do. They see patterns the rest of us miss." Outside, the threatened rain had begun to fall in earnest, drumming against the wooden walls and turning the village paths to mud. The sound was oddly comforting, providing a rhythm that seemed to match the steady progress they were making. Slow, persistent, inexorable. "Tomorrow we try for 5 steps," Torgar announced as he prepared to leave. 5 steps sounded simultaneously achievable and impossible. 3 steps had required everything she possessed in terms of strength, will, and determination. Adding 2 more seemed like doubling the distance to the moon, but as she settled back into her familiar position in the bed, Brynja found herself counting. 3 steps today, 5 steps tomorrow. How many steps to reach the door of her chamber? How many to cross the great hall? How many to stand outside and feel rain on her face? The walking stick pulsed warm against her palm, and for the first time since her illness, she allowed herself to think in terms of destinations rather than limitations. 3 weeks into their daily sessions, Brynja could walk the length of her chamber, 12 steps from bed to window, 12 steps back. The achievement felt monumental, though she knew any observer would see only a girl moving with agonizing slowness, heavily supported by a metal brace and a walking stick, covering a distance most people crossed without thought. But Torgar saw something else entirely. He watched her movements with the intensity of a master craftsman examining his finest work, noting subtle improvements in balance, tiny increases in the weight her legs could bear independently, gradual coordination between her intentions and her body's response. "Your left leg is waking up," he announced one morning after she completed her circuit without stumbling. Brynja paused at her window, breathing heavily from the exertion. "I can't feel anything." "Feeling and function aren't the same thing." "Watch." He knelt beside her left leg and pressed his thumb firmly against her calf muscle. "Your muscle contracted just now. Not much, barely visible, but it responded to stimulus." She stared down at her leg as if seeing it for the first time. The idea that some part of her body might be working without her awareness felt almost magical. For months, her legs had been dead weight, useful only as anchors keeping her in bed. The possibility that some deep, unconscious process might be rebuilding what the fever had torn down challenged everything she thought she knew about her condition. "What does that mean?" she asked. "It means your body remembers more than the healers believed possible. It means we're not just fighting for your right leg. We're fighting for both of them." The news should have brought pure joy, but instead it intensified the pressure she felt. Each day's session had become a test with consequences that extended far beyond her personal struggle. Her father's mood rose and fell with her progress. The household staff watched for signs of improvement or decline that might indicate which direction this strange experiment was heading. Even the village had developed opinions about her efforts, and those opinions were not universally supportive. The criticism had started subtly. Meaningful looks when Torgar passed through the village. Conversations that stopped abruptly when Steinar approached. Questions about whether it was wise to encourage false hope in situations where acceptance might be kinder. But as word spread that the Jarl's daughter was actually making progress, the whispers grew bolder. Astrid the Weaver had been the first to speak directly. She cornered Steinar outside the grain storage building on a morning when frost made every surface shine like polished silver. "Jarl, I mean no disrespect," she began, though her tone suggested otherwise. "But this spectacle with your daughter is becoming a distraction for the entire village." Steinar had learned to dread these conversations. Spectacle? The giant parading through our streets every morning, claiming he can work miracles where trained healers have failed. People are beginning to wonder if we're witnessing genuine recovery or elaborate self-deception. The accusation struck deep because it echoed Steinar's own fears. Each night, he lay awake analyzing every detail of Brynja's progress, searching for evidence that might support or contradict his growing hope. Were her improvements real, or was he seeing what he desperately wanted to see? Was Torgar a healer or a charlatan taking advantage of her father's grief? "She walks the length of her chamber," he said quietly. "Supported slowly in private," Astrid countered. "No one but you and the giant has witnessed these supposed improvements. For all we know, she's being carried and told to move her feet." The suggestion felt like blasphemy, but Steinar couldn't dismiss it entirely. He had no experience with recovery from such injuries. His knowledge came entirely from what Torgar told him and what he observed during brief visits to Brynja's chamber. Could he trust his own perceptions when his heart wanted so desperately to believe? "What do you suggest?" he asked. "A demonstration. If the girl has truly recovered enough to walk, let her prove it before witnesses. If she hasn't, then this cruel game should end before it does more harm to both of you." The idea terrified and intrigued him simultaneously. Public proof would silence the doubters and validate the enormous effort Brynja had invested in her recovery. But public failure would humiliate her and destroy the fragile confidence she had been building. The stakes felt impossibly high for what should have been a simple question. Could she walk or couldn't she? When he mentioned Astrid's suggestion to Torgar, the giant's reaction was immediate and decisive. Absolutely not. They were standing in the great hall, speaking in low tones while servants prepared the evening meal. The space felt cavernous and cold despite the roaring fire, and their conversation seemed to echo despite their efforts at discretion. "The village has legitimate concerns," Steinar pressed. "If Brynja has truly improved, she has improved, but improvement and readiness for public scrutiny are different things entirely." Torgar's voice carried an edge that had been absent during their previous discussions. "Your daughter is learning to trust her body again after a year of betrayal. That trust is fragile, easily shattered by the wrong kind of pressure. Then when will she be ready? When she decides she's ready. Not when the village's curiosity demands satisfaction." The conversation left both men frustrated. Steinar understood the logic of Torgar's position, but he also felt the weight of leading a community that was beginning to question his judgment. As a Jarl, His decisions affected everyone under his protection. Was it fair to ask them to simply trust in something they couldn't verify? In her chamber, Brynja wrestled with similar questions. She could hear the whispered conversations that stopped when she entered common areas during her brief excursions outside her room. She could see the mixture of hope and doubt in her father's eyes. She could feel the weight of expectations that seemed to grow heavier with each small improvement. The walking stick had become her constant companion, its familiar weight providing comfort during moments when the pressure felt overwhelming. She found herself talking to it sometimes, addressing her grandmother's spirit as if the old woman might offer guidance from beyond death. "They want proof," she whispered one evening as rain drummed against her window. "But what if I'm not as strong as they need me to be?" The carved runes seemed to pulse in the firelight, and for a moment Brynja could almost hear her grandmother's voice responding with characteristic directness. Strength isn't about meeting other people's expectations. It's about exceeding your own. The words, whether real or imagined, crystallized something that had been forming in her mind for days. She was walking for herself, not for the village's entertainment or her father's vindication. Her progress belonged to her, and she would share it when and how she chose. But the pressure continued to build, and she knew that eventually choice might be taken from her hands entirely. The turning point came on a morning when winter's grip began to loosen, and the first hints of spring stirred in the air outside Brynja's window. She had been working with Torgar for nearly 2 months, her progress measured in steps that gradually became steadier, distances that slowly increased, and moments of independence that grew longer each day. But that morning brought visitors. 3 village elders led by Gunnar the Law Speaker, a man whose opinions carried weight throughout the region. They arrived unannounced, their faces grave with the kind of seriousness that preceded difficult conversations. Steinar met them in the great hall, his stomach knotting as he recognized the formal nature of their visit. These men didn't come to chat or share news. They came to render judgment. "Jarl," Gunnar began without preamble, "we need to discuss the situation with your daughter and the stranger you've allowed into our community." "Torgar has done nothing but help," Steinar replied, though he could hear the defensive edge in his own voice. "Has he?" Gunnar's weathered face remained impassive. "For 2 months, this man has claimed to be healing a condition that defeated our best healers. Yet no one has seen proof of this alleged recovery. Meanwhile, our community grows restless with uncertainty." The second elder, Magnus the shipwright, leaned forward in his chair. "People are asking questions, Jarl, about leadership that chases impossible dreams instead of accepting reality, about resources spent on futile gestures while real needs go unaddressed." Steinar felt heat rise in his chest. "What resources?" "Torgar asks for nothing except the chance to help. He asks for credibility," Gunnar replied. "Every day he walks through our village, people wonder whether they're seeing a healer or a fraud. That uncertainty undermines confidence in judgment, yours and ours." The third elder, Olaf the grainkeeper, spoke for the first time. "We've come to propose a solution that serves everyone's interests. Tomorrow is the feast of spring's return. Let your daughter demonstrate her recovery before the assembled village. If she can walk unassisted, we'll proclaim Torgar a true healer and apologize for our doubts. If she cannot, he leaves our territory and this matter ends." The ultimatum hung in the air like smoke from a poorly banked fire. Steinar understood the politics behind their demand. These men needed resolution, something definitive they could present to a community grown tired of uncertainty. But he also understood what they were asking, that his daughter become a public spectacle, her private struggle transformed into entertainment for people who had never supported her efforts. "I need to discuss this with Brynja," he said finally. "Of course," Gunnar replied, "but understand that our patience has limits. The feast is tomorrow. Decision made or not, this matter will be settled then." After they left, Steinar sat alone in the great hall for a long time, staring into the fire and wrestling with choices that felt impossible. Protecting his daughter meant defying the village leadership. Satisfying the elders meant exposing Brynja to potential humiliation. There seemed no path that didn't require sacrifice. In her chamber, Brynja was completing her morning session with Torgar, unaware of the confrontation that had just concluded. She could now walk the perimeter of her room twice without stopping, could stand unassisted for several minutes, and could navigate the narrow space between her bed and window with increasing confidence. To her, the progress felt miraculous. To observers expecting complete recovery, it might seem barely adequate. "Something's different today," Torgar observed as she completed her circuit. "You're favoring the left side more than usual." He was right. Her left leg had been aching since she woke. Not with pain exactly, but with a deep sensation she couldn't quite identify. After months of numbness, any feeling at all seemed significant. "It's like something sleeping is trying to wake up," she said, settling onto the edge of her bed. Torgar knelt beside her, his massive hands gentle as he examined her leg through the fabric of her dress. "May I?" he asked, and when she nodded, he pressed his palm against her calf. The sensation that followed was unlike anything Brynja had experienced since her illness. Not full feeling, but something more than numbness, a distant awareness that her leg existed and was responding to touch. Her breath caught in her throat. "You felt that?" "I felt something." Tears began to form in her eyes, though she couldn't say whether they were from joy or fear. "What does it mean?" "It means your body is healing in ways we didn't dare hope for. The nerves that carry sensation are beginning to reconnect." Torgar's voice carried wonder and caution in equal measure. "But feeling and function are still different things. Don't expect too much too quickly." The warning proved prophetic when Steinar arrived an hour later to tell her about the elders' ultimatum. The joy that had been building from her morning's breakthrough transformed instantly into anxiety that made her chest feel tight and her breathing shallow. "Tomorrow," she whispered. "They want me to perform like a trained animal at the feast." "They want proof," Steinar said, though his own reluctance was obvious. "The village needs to see that our faith in Torgar has been justified. And if I fail, if I stumble or fall or simply can't meet their expectations?" The questions tumbled out faster than she could process them. "What then?" Torgar had listened to the conversation in silence, his expression growing darker with each detail. Now he stood and moved to the window, his massive frame blocking most of the light as he stared out at the village that had issued its challenge. "This is exactly what I warned against," he said finally. "Your recovery is not a spectacle for public entertainment. It's a private journey that belongs to you alone. But if I don't try, they'll force you to leave." Brynja looked between the two men who had become the anchors of her world. "I can't let your kindness be repaid with exile." "My reputation can weather their doubts," Torgar replied. "Your confidence might not survive their scrutiny." The walking stick lay across her lap, its familiar weight offering comfort in the midst of uncertainty. Brynja found herself thinking about her grandmother again, about a woman who had faced her own physical limitations with dignity and determination. What would the old woman have done in this situation? The answer came with surprising clarity. Her grandmother would have walked into that feast hall and shown them exactly what she was capable of. Not because they demanded it, but because she chose to share her strength. "I want to try," Brynja said quietly. Both men turned to stare at her, surprise evident on their faces. "Not because they're forcing me to," she continued, her voice growing stronger with conviction, "but because I'm ready to show myself what I can do. Win or lose, succeed or fail, I want to find out how far I've come." Torgar studied her face with the intensity of someone reading ancient runes, searching for hidden meanings beneath the surface words. What he saw there seemed to satisfy him. "Then we have work to do," he said. "If you're going to walk before the village, we need to prepare for every possibility." The die was cast. Tomorrow, before assembled witnesses, Brynja would either triumph or fail in the most public way imaginable. But for the first time since her illness, the choice had been truly hers to make. The revelation came at sunset on the evening before the feast, when Brynja was attempting her final practice session before the next day's public demonstration. She had been walking with increasing confidence throughout the day, her left leg showing signs of awakening sensation that gave her hope for the morning's challenge. But as she completed her third circuit of the chamber, something caught her eye through the window, a figure moving furtively through the shadows between buildings. The person was too distant to identify clearly, but something about their movement struck her as deliberately secretive. "Torgar," she called softly. "Look outside. Someone is watching the hall." He joined her at the window, his expression darkening as he observed the figure. After a moment, the person stepped briefly into a patch of moonlight, and Torgar's intake of breath was audible in the quiet chamber. "I know him," he said grimly. "That's Halvard the Wise, supposedly a healer from the eastern settlements, but he's no healer at all." "What do you mean?" Torgar moved away from the window, his massive hands clenched into fists. "He's a fraud who travels between communities, offering miraculous cures that never materialize. He takes payment from desperate families and disappears before his failures become obvious." Brynja felt cold dread settling in her stomach. "Why would he be here?" "Because word has spread about your recovery. If you succeed tomorrow, it validates the idea that impossible healings can occur. If you fail, it proves that such claims are always false." Torgar began pacing the small chamber like a caged bear. "Either way, he benefits. Success gives him cover for his own fraudulent claims. Failure discredits all unconventional healing, including legitimate efforts like ours." The implications struck Brynja like a physical blow. "He wants me to fail. Worse than that, he'll ensure you fail if he can." Torgar's voice carried a grim certainty that made her blood freeze. Men like Halvard don't leave important outcomes to chance. Before Brynja could ask what he meant, her chamber door burst open without warning. Steinar stumbled inside, his face pale with panic and his clothes disheveled as if he had been running. "Father, what's happened?" "The feast ale," he gasped, trying to catch his breath. "Magnus was testing the barrels for tomorrow's celebration. 3 men have already fallen ill. Violent stomach sickness, fever, weakness in their limbs." Torgar and Brynja exchanged a look of horrified understanding. The symptoms Steinar described matched perfectly with certain plant poisons that could mimic or worsen conditions affecting muscle control and coordination. "Who had access to the ale?" Torgar demanded. "The usual brewers, the servants who moved the barrels, a few visitors who offered to help with preparations." Steinar stopped mid-sentence as the full implication hit him, including a healer from the east who claimed he wanted to bless the feast for good fortune. "Halvard?" Brynja whispered. The name meant nothing to Steinar, but Torgar's expression confirmed his worst fears. "He's poisoned the ale that would have been served tomorrow. Not enough to kill, but enough to make you sick. Sick enough that any attempt to walk would end in collapse and humiliation. But the other men who fell ill were unfortunate enough to sample what was meant for you." Torgar's voice carried cold fury. "Halvard probably intended to slip you a special cup during the feast, claiming it would give you strength for your demonstration." Brynja sank onto her bed, the walking stick trembling in her hands. The enormity of the deception left her feeling dizzy and nauseous, emotions that had nothing to do with poison but everything to do with the realization that someone had been willing to destroy her chances of success for his own benefit. "What do we do?" Steinar asked. "The feast is tomorrow. The entire village will be expecting." "We proceed as planned," Brynja said quietly. Both men stared at her in surprise. "Brynja, the risk," Torgar began. "The risk was always there," she interrupted, her voice growing stronger with each word. "This just changes its nature. Instead of risking failure through my own limitations, I'm risking failure through someone else's sabotage. But the choice remains the same. Try or surrender. She stood, gripping her walking stick for support, and moved to the window. Below, the village spread out in the moonlight, peaceful and unaware of the drama unfolding in their Jarl's hall. Tomorrow, those same people would gather to witness what they believed would be a simple demonstration of recovery or failure. Instead, they would see the resolution of a conflict between truth and deception, between genuine healing and calculated fraud. "There's something else," she said, turning back to face the men. "This Hallvard, he didn't just come here randomly, did he? Someone sent word to him about my recovery." Torgar nodded grimly. Word travels fast among certain circles. When a supposedly impossible healing begins to show results, people take notice. Some to celebrate, others to profit, and some to ensure it fails so their own failures look less obvious, Steinar added, his understanding of the situation growing clearer. Brynja felt a strange calm settling over her, replacing the panic that had initially gripped her. The walking stick seemed to pulse warm in her hand, and she found herself thinking again of her grandmother, a woman who had faced obstacles with quiet determination rather than dramatic gestures. "Then we give them a demonstration they won't forget," she said. "Not just of my ability to walk, but of the difference between real healing and false promises." "What do you propose?" Torgar asked. "We expose Hallvard publicly, show the village exactly what kind of man opposes genuine recovery. Let them see the difference between someone who builds people up and someone who tears them down for profit." The plan that emerged from their hurried conversation was both simple and dangerous. They would proceed with the feast as scheduled, but with preparations that would turn Hallvard's sabotage against him. Instead of being victims of his deception, they would make him the architect of his own exposure. "Are you certain you want to do this?" Steinar asked as they finalized the details. "Once we start down this path, there's no retreat." Brynja looked out at the village one more time, then at the walking stick that had become her symbol of perseverance through impossible circumstances. "I've spent 2 months learning to walk again," she said. "Tomorrow, I learn whether I can run toward the truth instead of away from it." The die was cast, but now it would be thrown in a very different game than anyone had expected. The feast of spring's return dawned crisp and clear, with sunlight streaming through the great hall's windows and illuminating the long tables that had been arranged for the village gathering. Servants moved with purposeful efficiency, setting out wooden bowls and carved drinking horns, while the aroma of roasted meat and fresh bread filled the air. Brynja had barely slept, her mind cycling through every detail of the plan they had devised to expose Hallvard's treachery. The strategy was elegant in its simplicity, but it required perfect timing and nerves that she wasn't certain she possessed. One mistake, one moment of hesitation, and the entire plan would collapse. Torgar arrived at her chamber before dawn, carrying a different leg brace than the one she had grown accustomed to using. This device was lighter, less conspicuous, designed to provide support without advertising its presence to casual observers. "For today, you need to appear as strong as possible," he explained as he helped her adjust the new brace. "The old device served its purpose for training, but this one will serve our purposes for theater." "Theater," Brynja repeated, testing the feel of the new brace as she stood. "Is that what this has become?" "It was always theater," Torgar replied. "The question was whether you would be the star of your own story or a supporting character in someone else's deception." The new brace felt strange at first, providing less obvious structure than she had grown used to. But as she took her first experimental steps, she realized it offered a different kind of support, one that worked with her recovering muscles rather than replacing their function entirely. "How do I look?" she asked, after completing a circuit of her chamber. "Like a young woman who has overcome impossible odds through determination and courage." Torgar's voice carried genuine admiration, "Which is exactly what you are." An hour before the feast was scheduled to begin, the first guests started arriving at the great hall. Brynja watched from her window as familiar faces filled the courtyard. Neighbors who had known her since childhood, visiting traders who had heard rumors of her recovery, even delegations from nearby settlements who had come to witness what some called a miracle and others dismissed as elaborate fraud. She could see Hallvard among the crowd, a thin man with calculating eyes who moved through the gathering like a wolf studying a flock of sheep. He wore the robes of a learned healer and carried a staff decorated with symbols that suggested wisdom and power. To most observers, he would appear to be exactly what he claimed, a wise man drawn by curiosity about an unusual healing. But Brynja could see the predatory attention with which he watched the proceedings, the way his gaze kept returning to the hall's entrance as if anticipating something specific. He was waiting for her appearance, ready to spring whatever trap he had prepared. "Second thoughts?" Steinar asked, entering her chamber with an expression that mixed pride and terror in equal measure. "Constant thoughts," Brynja replied, "but none of them involved changing my mind." Her father had aged visibly overnight, the stress of orchestrating their counterplan etching new lines around his eyes. As Jarl, he bore responsibility not just for his daughter's welfare, but for the village's trust in his judgment. If their gambit failed, he would face questions about his fitness to lead that might prove impossible to answer. "The altered ale has been distributed as planned," he reported quietly. "Magnus and his men know to watch for Hallvard's move. Are you ready?" Brynja looked down at her grandmother's walking stick, its familiar weight resting across her palms. The carved runes seemed to pulse with warm energy, as if the old woman's spirit was lending strength for the challenge ahead. "I've been ready since the day Torgar first helped me stand," she said. "Everything else has just been preparation for this moment." The great hall filled rapidly as the appointed hour approached. Brynja could hear the rumble of conversation, the scrape of benches being moved, the general commotion of a community gathering for celebration and spectacle in equal measure. Some voices carried excitement, others skepticism, but all conveyed the heightened attention of people witnessing something they believed would be significant. Torgar returned to escort her to the hall, his massive presence both comforting and intimidating. Today he wore his finest clothes, leather and fur that spoke of wealth earned through legendary skill in battle. He looked every inch the warrior hero that songs were written about, and Brynja drew strength from his unwavering confidence. "Remember," he said as they prepared to leave her chamber, "whatever happens in there, you've already won the most important victory. You've proven to yourself that impossible things can become possible with enough determination." "But proving it to others matters too," she replied. "Not for my sake, but for everyone who comes after me, everyone who faces their own impossible circumstances and needs to know that surrender isn't the only option." They made their way through the corridor that connected her chamber to the great hall, Brynja's steps measured but steady. The new brace allowed her to walk with dignity while still providing the support she needed. To observers, she would appear to be moving under her own power with only minimal assistance from her walking stick. At the entrance to the great hall, they paused. Beyond the doorway lay every person of importance in their region, all waiting to witness what many believed would be either a miracle or a humiliation. The noise of conversation faded as word of her arrival spread through the crowd. "Now?" Torgar asked. Brynja took a deep breath, feeling the solid weight of the walking stick in her hand and the reassuring presence of Torgar beside her. Somewhere in that crowd waited Hallvard with his poison and his schemes, ready to destroy her moment of triumph for his own benefit. But also in that crowd were people who had watched her struggle, who understood what her recovery meant beyond simple physical healing. "Now," she confirmed. They stepped through the doorway together, and the great hall fell silent as 200 pairs of eyes turned to watch a young woman walk into the most important moment of her life. The silence stretched, heavy with anticipation and judgment, broken only by the soft sound of her footsteps on the wooden floor. Hallvard stood among the crowd, his hand moving to the leather pouch at his belt, where a specially prepared drinking horn waited. one that contained enough concentrated poison to ensure that any attempt at extended walking would end in spectacular collapse. His plan was simple. Offer the horn as a ceremonial blessing, watch her drink, then witness her inevitable failure as proof that miraculous recoveries were always illusions. But as Brynja moved steadily across the hall, her steps sure and her bearing dignified, he began to realize that his assumptions about her condition might have been dangerously incomplete. This was not the broken girl he had expected to exploit, but a young woman who moved with the confidence of someone who had already won her most important battles. The walking stick clicked softly against the floor with each step, marking rhythm like a drum beat that matched the racing hearts of everyone present. Brynja had practiced this walk in the privacy of her chamber, but here, before the assembled community, it felt like crossing from one world into another, from the realm of limitation into the territory of possibility. At the center of the hall, she stopped and turned to face the crowd, her grandmother's walking stick planted firmly beside her as both support and symbol. The moment of truth had arrived, and with it, the final test of everything she had worked to achieve. The silence in the great hall stretched like a held breath as Brynja stood at its center, her grandmother's walking stick planted firmly beside her. 200 faces watched her with expressions ranging from skeptical curiosity to hopeful anticipation. The weight of their collective attention felt heavier than any physical burden she had carried during her recovery. "My friends," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the vast space, "you have come to witness whether the daughter of your Jarl can truly walk again after a year of being bedridden. I stand before you now, not to prove anything to you, but to share what I have learned about the difference between genuine healing and elaborate deception." A murmur rippled through the crowd. This was not the simple demonstration they had expected. Near the back of the hall, Halvard shifted uncomfortably, his hand moving instinctively toward the poisoned drinking horn concealed in his robes. Something in Brynja's tone suggested this gathering might not proceed according to his carefully laid plans. 2 months ago, Brynja continued, a man came to our hall offering help when every trained healer had declared my condition permanent. Torgar Bearborn asked for nothing in return, no payment, no promises, no guarantees of success. He offered only his time, his knowledge, and his belief that impossible things sometimes become possible through persistent effort. She took 3 deliberate steps forward, her movement steady and controlled despite the intensity of being watched by so many eyes. The walking stick provided balance and confidence, but clearly she was moving under her own power. But yesterday, we discovered that another kind of healer has also taken interest in my recovery. A man who calls himself Halvard the Wise, who travels between communities offering miraculous cures that somehow never quite materialize. The murmur in the crowd grew louder as people began looking around, searching for the stranger Brynja had named. Halvard's face had gone pale, but he remained motionless, perhaps hoping his anonymity might still protect him. "This false healer didn't come to help me walk," Brynja said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "He came to ensure that I would fail, publicly and dramatically, so that he could use my humiliation to discredit all unconventional healing and make his own fraudulent practices appear more credible by comparison." Magnus the shipwright stepped forward from his position near the ale barrels, holding up a drinking horn that glinted darkly in the firelight. "Last night, we found plant poison in ale that was specially prepared for today's demonstration, enough to cause violent illness and muscle weakness in anyone who drank it." Gasps echoed through the hall as the implications became clear. Someone had attempted to sabotage not just Brynja's demonstration, but potentially the entire feast celebration. The violation of hospitality and trust cut deep in a community where such bonds formed the foundation of survival. "Where is this Halvard?" called out Gunnar the law speaker, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to dispensing justice. For a moment, no one moved. Then slowly, reluctantly, a figure near the back of the hall raised his hand. Halvard had clearly hoped to slip away unnoticed, but escape was no longer possible. He stood with the resignation of someone whose carefully constructed plans had collapsed around him. "I'm Halvard," he said, his voice carrying across the silent hall. "But these accusations are based on misunderstanding and suspicion, not evidence." Torgar had been standing quietly beside one of the supporting pillars, but now he stepped forward, his massive presence commanding immediate attention. "Then you won't object to drinking from the horn that was specially prepared for Brynja?" he asked, his tone deceptively casual. The challenge hung in the air like smoke from a green fire. If Halvard was innocent, drinking the allegedly poisoned ale would prove it. If he was guilty, the same action would expose him definitively. Either way, his response would reveal the truth. Halvard's eyes darted frantically around the hall, searching for escape routes that no longer existed. The crowd had subtly shifted position, forming a loose circle that prevented easy departure. His hand moved again toward the concealed drinking horn at his belt, the one containing his own poison meant for Brynja's consumption. "This is preposterous," he said, his voice rising with desperation. "I am a respected healer, not some common poisoner. I refuse to participate in this theatrical accusation." "Then let's examine your credentials," Brynja said calmly. "Tell us about the miraculous recoveries you've facilitated. Provide names of people you've healed, communities where your successes can be verified." The request was entirely reasonable, the kind of reference any legitimate healer would be proud to provide. But Halvard's continued silence spoke more eloquently than any words could have. He stood trapped between truth and exposure, his reputation crumbling with each moment of hesitation. "I've treated many people," he said finally, his voice lacking conviction. "Privacy prevents me from sharing details of individual cases." "Privacy?" repeated Eric the blacksmith with obvious skepticism. "How convenient that your greatest successes must remain secret while you publicly challenge the one recovery we can all witness." The crowd's mood was shifting from curiosity to anger as they began to understand the full scope of what had nearly transpired. Someone had traveled to their community specifically to destroy a young woman's moment of triumph, to poison their celebration, to profit from manufactured failure. Brynja took another step forward, closing the distance between herself and Halvard. Her movement was deliberate and controlled, a living demonstration of the recovery he had sought to sabotage. "The difference between a true healer and a false one," she said, her voice carrying clearly to every corner of the hall, "is that true healers build people up while false ones tear them down. True healers celebrate recovery while false ones profit from continued suffering." She raised her grandmother's walking stick, not as a weapon, but as a symbol of the strength that had carried her through impossible circumstances. "I stand before you now not because of any miracle, but because someone believed in me when I had stopped believing in myself. Because someone offered hope when everyone else offered only sympathy. Because someone saw possibility where others saw only limitation." Halvard's composure finally cracked under the weight of 200 hostile stares and the impossibility of escape. His hand moved desperately to the poisoned drinking horn at his belt, but instead of offering it as planned, he clutched it like a talisman against exposure. "You want proof of my abilities?" he snarled, his mask of wisdom finally slipping to reveal the calculating predator beneath. "I'll show you exactly what your precious recovery is worth." He raised the horn toward his lips as if to drink, then suddenly pivoted and hurled it directly at Brynja. The deadly liquid arced through the air, aimed with vicious precision at her face and mouth. But Torgar had been watching for exactly this kind of desperate gambit. His massive hand shot out, intercepting the horn in mid-flight with reflexes that belied his size. The poisoned ale splashed harmlessly against the wooden floor, hissing and steaming where it struck. The crowd gasped at the blatant attempt at murder they had just witnessed. Whatever doubts might have remained about Halvard's intentions evaporated in that moment of pure malice. "Seize him!" commanded Gunnar the law speaker, his voice thundering through the hall. But Hallvard had one final card to play. From beneath his robes he produced a curved dagger that glinted wickedly in the firelight. The blade was clearly poisoned. Dark stains along its edge suggested the same toxins that had contaminated the ale. "Stay back," he warned, waving the weapon wildly as strong men began to advance from all sides. "I'll cut down anyone who tries to stop me." The crowd instinctively pulled back, creating a wider circle around the desperate man. But Brynja, instead of retreating, took another step forward. "You're afraid," she said simply, her voice cutting through his frantic threats like a blade through silk. "Afraid that my recovery proves everything you've built your life on is a lie." "Your recovery is meaningless," Hallvard spat, though his voice carried the edge of hysteria. A few steps with a stick and a brace. Any fool could manage that much deception. "Then watch this," Brynja said calmly. What happened next would be spoken of in the halls of the Northlands for generations to come. Brynja handed her grandmother's walking stick to Torgar, then reached down and began unfastening the straps of her leg brace. The crowd watched in stunned silence as she removed the device entirely, setting it aside on one of the feast tables. For a moment, she stood completely unsupported, her legs bearing her full weight without assistance for the first time in over a year. Then, with deliberate grace, she took one step forward, then another, and another. The sensation in her left leg had returned enough to provide feedback, while her right leg had regained most of its strength through months of patient rebuilding. She was not the same as before her illness. Perhaps she never would be, but she was walking under her own power, with her own will, carrying her own weight. Hallvard's face went ashen as he watched her approach. The dagger trembled in his hand as his entire worldview crumbled before his eyes. If genuine healing was possible, if impossible recoveries could actually occur, then his life's work of exploiting desperation had been not just fraudulent, but actively evil. "Impossible," he whispered. "Only if you insist it must be," Brynja replied, now standing close enough to touch the blade he held between them. "The choice has always been whether to believe in possibility or surrender to limitation." Her calm presence seemed to drain the fight from him. The dagger slipped from nerveless fingers, clattering against the wooden floor. Hallvard sank to his knees as strong hands finally reached him, though he offered no resistance. But Brynja wasn't finished. She turned to face the assembled crowd, her stance steady and confident despite the absence of any support. "This man came here to prove that miraculous recoveries are always fraudulent," she said, her voice carrying to every corner of the hall. "Instead, he has proven that the only fraud was his own fear of genuine possibility." Then, in a gesture that would be remembered and retold for generations, she knelt beside the fallen Hallvard. Not in triumph, but in compassion. "I forgive you," she said quietly, though her words carried clearly through the silent hall. "Because I understand what it means to lose hope, to believe that impossible things must always remain impossible. But I also know that forgiveness can heal wounds that time alone cannot touch." She rose gracefully and turned toward where her father stood with tears streaming down his weathered face. Step by careful step, she walked to him without support, without assistance, with nothing but her own determination and the strength she had rebuilt through months of patient effort. When she reached him, Steinar opened his arms and she stepped into his embrace while the entire hall erupted in cheers that shook the rafters. The walking stick remained in Torgar's massive hands, but it was no longer needed. It had served its purpose, carrying her through the darkest period of her life until she could carry herself again. 3 months after the feast that changed everything, Brynja stood at the edge of the fjord, watching the morning mist rise from water that reflected the pale spring sun like scattered silver. Her legs, strengthened by daily walks that now carried her far beyond the confines of her father's hall, supported her easily as she breathed in the clean air that spoke of new beginnings. The walking stick rested against her shoulder. Not because she needed it for balance anymore, but because it had become a cherished companion, a reminder of the journey that had brought her from despair to hope to triumph. The carved runes seemed to pulse with warm life in the morning light, as if her grandmother's spirit continued to offer guidance for the path ahead. Behind her, the village had settled into a new rhythm. Word of her recovery and the exposure of Halvard's deception had traveled far beyond their small settlement, bringing visitors from distant communities, some seeking healing, others simply wanting to witness proof that impossible things could indeed become possible with enough determination and the right kind of support. Torgar had become something of a legend himself, though he handled the attention with the same quiet dignity he had shown throughout her recovery. He had established a proper healing practice in a hall that Jarl Steinar had built specifically for his use, where he worked with others facing their own seemingly insurmountable challenges. The techniques he had developed with Brynja were being refined and adapted for different conditions, different needs, different dreams of recovery. "The ships will return soon," came a familiar voice behind her. Brynja turned to see her father approaching, his face bearing the easy smile that had returned in the months since her public demonstration. The weight of grief that had aged him so dramatically during her illness had lifted, replaced by the quiet satisfaction of a man who had witnessed his daughter transform limitation into possibility. "Eric's expedition?" she asked. "Due back before midday, and according to the signal fires, they're bringing guests." Steinar settled beside her on the large stone that had become her favorite morning perch. 3 ships instead of the 2 that departed. Visitors from the southern settlements, most likely. More people seeking miraculous cures. Brynja said with gentle humor. They'll be disappointed to learn that the only miracle was refusing to accept that recovery was impossible. The fame that had come with her story brought complications she was still learning to navigate. Some visitors arrived with genuine need and realistic expectations. Others came seeking instant transformation, unwilling to accept that true healing required time, effort, and a willingness to do the difficult work of rebuilding what had been broken. "Speaking of visitors," Steinar said carefully, "there's something I need to discuss with you." The tone in his voice made Brynja look at him more sharply. "What kind of something?" "A proposal. From Jarl Magnus of the Western Fjords. He has a son, Eriksson, who apparently has been much impressed by the stories of your courage and determination." Brynja felt her cheeks warm slightly. Marriage proposals were not unexpected for the daughter of a Jarl, especially one whose story had spread throughout the northern territories. But the timing felt strange, as if her newfound mobility was somehow connected to her newfound marriageability. "And what does this Eriksson know of courage and determination?" she asked. "He lost his right arm in a ship battle 2 years ago. According to his father, he's spent the time since learning to fight left-handed, to work one-handed, to live fully, despite what others might consider a permanent limitation." Steinar's smile carried genuine warmth. "It seems you've attracted the attention of someone who understands something about overcoming the impossible." The idea intrigued her more than she had expected. For so long, the prospect of marriage had seemed as distant as the prospect of walking, something that belonged to the life she had lost rather than the life she might yet build. Now, the possibility of sharing that rebuilt life with someone who understood the value of persistence felt like another kind of healing. "Will I meet him?" "That choice is yours, as all the important choices are now." Steinar stood and stretched, his movements carrying the easy confidence of someone no longer burdened by impossible problems. "But first, you might want to come greet our other visitors. Torgar says one of them has brought something that belonged to your grandmother." Brynja's heart quickened. Any artifact connected to the woman who had somehow foreseen the walking stick's importance carried significance beyond simple family sentiment. They walked back to the hall together, Brynja's steps sure and steady on the familiar path. The village had awakened fully while they talked, with smoke rising from cooking fires and the comfortable sounds of daily life filling the air. Children played in the spaces between buildings, their laughter echoing off wooden walls and creating the kind of joyful noise that spoke of communities at peace with themselves. In the great hall, Torgar waited with 3 strangers, 2 men and a woman, all bearing the weather-beaten appearance of serious travelers. The woman carried a wrapped bundle that she handled with careful reverence. "Brynja," she said as they were introduced, "I am Astrid Wise' daughter, keeper of records for the southern settlements. Your grandmother saved my brother's life many years ago, and when I heard of your recovery, I knew I must bring you this." She unwrapped the bundle to reveal a second walking stick, clearly carved by the same hands that had created Brynja's, but decorated with different runes, different symbols of strength and perseverance. "She made 2, Astrid explained. One for the granddaughter she knew would need it, and one for the granddaughter that granddaughter would someday have, the child who would inherit both the stick and the story of what determination could accomplish when properly applied." Brynja accepted the second stick with hands that trembled slightly. The wood was warm to the touch, and the runes seemed to shimmer with the same inner light she had come to associate with her grandmother's continuing presence in her life. She saw that far ahead. She whispered. "Wise women often do," Torgar said softly. "They see patterns the rest of us miss, connections that span generations." Brynja held both walking sticks, one in each hand, and felt the weight of legacy settling around her shoulders like a cloak passed down through generations of strong women. Her grandmother had prepared not just for her own recovery, but for the recovery of daughters yet unborn, for struggles yet to be faced, for impossible things yet to be made possible. Outside, the sound of approaching ships grew louder as Eric's expedition returned with their guests and their cargo of new possibilities. The future spread before her like an uncharted fjord, full of challenges and opportunities that would require all the strength, wisdom, and determination she had learned to cultivate. But as she stood there, holding the physical proof of her grandmother's faith in the future, Brynja knew she was ready for whatever came next. She had learned to walk again, learned to hope again, learned to believe in the possibility of impossible things, and she had learned that the greatest healing came not from recovering what had been lost, but from discovering what had always been possible.